Am I live? Is anybody there? That was tricky. Can you hear me okay? Is my audio fine? Great. I feel live. Wow. Hi, Christopher. Tyler Buswell. No, it's the worst. Ugh. How's everybody in Portland? Are you guys fine? So I'm here to do the Artslandia Happy Hour, which is why I'm drinking wine because it's a happy hour. Hi, Nicole Lane. Oh my gosh. All the people who are here are making me super nervous about reading you Shakespeare and answering questions about stuff because you're all so smart. Why is everyone logged on so early? Like 6 minutes early. It doesn't seem like that's. Uh... Hi, Justin. Oh my gosh. Hi. Oh, thanks, Nicole. It feels like some sort of weird late 90s dating site thing, right? I guess this is what theater is all about now, though. Me speaking into a void and waiting for feedback and affirmation from a faceless online community. Yeah. Is someone who's responsible for Artslandia going to tell me like when to go? Or do I just need to keep looking at the clock? Hi, Misty. Thanks for inviting me to do this. You guys are such weirdos. There are lots of other Shakespeare dorks that still live in Portland. You could have found someone rather than trying to snag me from the wilds of central Idaho. Happy hour, Denise. Thanks for joining us. Does everybody actually have a cocktail? Is that how this goes? Everybody gets a cocktail? Idaho is beautiful. It was snowing earlier today. We are all every night at 8 p.m. We all go stand out in our driveways and we howl like wolves to show our gratitude for the frontline staff of the hospitals and all of the various healthcare workers. Um, so, howling like a wolf is basically the way people in the Sun Valley region show their gratitude. It's pretty crazy here. We've been hit pretty hard over the last few weeks. Thanks for everybody inviting me to come. It's nice to see a number of friendly names on my comment screen. I hope you're not expecting me to sing or anything. I've been watching some of the other uh, Artslandia happy hours, and those people are like really talented, and I'm just a dork. So that knows a little bit about Shakespeare. So you all stand outside and howl like wolves at 7 p.m., or do you just applaud or do something else? I thought it was uniquely Sun Valley that people would be out here howling like wolves. Hi, Erica. Thanks for coming to Artslandia's Happy Hour. What Facebook message did you send me, Ashley? You tell me when. Is that better, Ashley? I can just scoot over rather than messing with the camera. Beautiful. Thank you. It's been a long time since anyone described me as beautiful. I appreciate it. Height is great. Thank you. I'm so pleased. Looks great. Perfect. Great. This is the quietest audience I've ever performed for. This is remarkable. I can just say whatever I want and I don't really have to worry about whether or not you like it. That's awesome. It's the perfect place for an artistic director. I'm worried about all of you in Portland. I hope you're all doing well. Sounds like things are similar, lockdown, shelter in place there. It's 5 p.m. Sounds like I'm supposed to go for it. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Palmer. I am the artistic director of Company of Fools. We are a professional theater based in Haley, Idaho, in the beautiful Sun Valley region of central Idaho. It's a fantastic theater. It's about to celebrate its 25th anniversary. I've been the artistic director here for just over a year. Prior to that time, I was the founding artistic director of Bag and Baggage Productions based in Hillsboro, Oregon. And prior to that, I was the founding artistic director of of Glasgow Repertory Company in Glasgow, Scotland. Most of my work as an artistic director has been largely focused on the classics, including Shakespeare and major world premiere adaptations of Shakespeare. I have a long and sordid history with Artslandia. I have been in love with Artslandia and supportive of Artslandia for many years while I was in Portland. So I am very, very pleased to have been invited to join you tonight for Artslandia's Happy Hour. Yes, please pour yourself some wine or something stronger. The more you drink, the better my performance will be. I have been invited randomly to talk a little bit about Shakespeare tonight and also to perform or read to you. It's really not a play. One of Shakespeare's epic poems entitled Venus and Adonis, which he wrote during a period of uh, of of isolation during a plague in London. And I will spend a lot more time talking about Shakespeare's work um, while he was isolated, both during this period and also at various other times. I think it's important. People have probably been seeing all of these crazy posts and articles in the New York Times and all over the place about how Shakespeare was hugely creative and produced all this amazing work during his time in isolation during the plague. And I just want you all to know that that is a terrible standard to hold ourselves to. Shakespeare was a pretty good writer before the plague happened. And so, I mean, I think getting through the day, doing laundry, feeding yourself, drinking some wine, checking in with your family, maybe reading a book, watching some Netflix, all of those things are equally excellent accomplishments during our time in isolation. I thought we would just sort of start off by having me read to you. It's actually one of my favorite works of Shakespeare. This beautiful, pretty sexy, kind of slightly gendered, interestingly gendered uh, reinterpretation story of Venus and Adonis, which originally comes from Ovid in the Metamorphoses. It's one of the great kind of love stories of antiquity and of mythology. Shakespeare did a really remarkable thing by taking some of that original material in that original story, and kind of turning it a little bit on its head. I'm not sure if Artslandia sent out the edited version of Venus and Adonis. It takes about 10 minutes to read. And then as soon as I'm done with that, I am happy to turn my attention to all of the questions you might have about Shakespeare and his time during the plague, as well as any questions you might have about Venus and Adonis. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the weirdest poetry performance I've ever done in my life, but I'm really, really excited to have you all here. I am pleased to read to you now Venus and Adonis by William Shakespeare. Even as the sun, with purple-colored face, had ta'en his leave of the weeping morn, rose-cheeked Adonis hied him to the chase. Hunting he loved, but love he loved to scorn. Sick-thoughted Venus makes a main unto him, and like a bold-faced suitor gins to woo him. Thrice fairer than myself, thus she began, the field's chief flower, sweet above compare, stain to all nymphs, more lovely than a man. More white and red than doves or roses are. Nature that made thee, with herself at strife, saith that the world hath ending with thy life. With this she seetheth upon his sweating palm, the precedent of pith and livelihood, and trembling in her passion, calls it balm, earth's sovereign salve to do a goddess good. Being so enraged, desire doth lend her force courageously to pluck him from his horse. Over one arm the lusty coursers rein, under her other was the tender boy, who blushed and pouted in disdain, with leaden appetite, unapt to joy. She red as hot as coals of glowing fire, he red for shame, but frosty in desire. Look, how a bird lies tangled in a net, so fastened in her arms Adonis lies. Pure shame and odd resistance made him fret, which bred more beauty in his angry eyes. Rain added to a river that is rank, perforce will force it overflow the bank. Never did passenger in summer's heat more thirst for drink than she for this good turn. Her help she sees, but help she cannot get. She bathes in water, yet her fire must burn. Oh, pity, 'gain she cry, flint-hearted boy, 'tis but a kiss I beg. Why art thou coy? And now Adonis, with a lazy sprite, and with a heavy, dark, disliking eye, his lowering brows o'erwhelming his fair sight, like misty vapors when they blot the sky, souring his cheeks, cries, Fie! No more of love! The sun doth burn my face, I must remove. Ay me, quoth Venus, young and so unkind? What bare excuses makest thou to be gone? I'll sigh celestial breath, whose gentle wind shall cool the heat of this descending sun. I'll make a shadow of thee of my hairs, and if they burn too, I'll quench them with my tears. At this, Adonis smiles as in disdain, that in each cheek appears a pretty dimple. Love made those hollows. If himself were slain, he might be buried in a tomb so simple. For knowing well, if there he came to lie, well, there love lived, and there he could not die. For pity now, she can no more detain him. The poor fool prays that he may depart. She is resolved no longer to restrain him, bids him farewell, and look well to her heart. The which by Cupid's bow she doth protest, he carries thence encaged in his breast. Sweet boy, she says, this night I'll waste in sorrow, for my sick heart commands mine eyes to watch. Tell me, love's master, shall we meet tomorrow? Say, shall we? Shall we? Wilt thou make the match? He tells her, no. Tomorrow he intends to hunt the boar with certain of his friends. The boar, quoth she, whereat a sudden pale, like lawn being spread upon the blushing rose, usurps her cheek. She trembles at his tale, and on his neck her yoking arms she throws. But if thou needs will hunt be ruled by me, uncouple at the timorous flying hare, or at the fox which lives by subtlety, or at the roe which no encounter dare, pursue these fearful creatures o'er the downs, and on thy well-breathed horse keep thy hounds. Nay, then, quoth the Dawn, you will fall again into your idle overhandled theme. The kiss I gave you is bestowed in vain, and all in vain you strive against the stream. For by this black-faced night, desire's foul nurse, your treatise makes me like you worse and worse. With this, he breaketh from the sweet embrace of those fair arms which bound him to her breast, and homeward through the dark lawn runs apace, leaves love upon her back deeply distressed. Look, how a bright star shooteth from the sky, so glides he in the night from Venus' eye. And now she beats her heart whereat it groans, that all the neighbor caves, as seeming troubled, make verbal repetition of her moans. Passion on passion deeply is redoubled. Ay me, she cries, and 20 times, woe, woe. And 20 echoes 20 times cry so. By this, she hears the hounds are at a bay, whereat she starts like one that spies an adder wreathed up in fatal folds just in his way, the fear whereof doth make him shake and shudder. Even so the timorous yelping of the hounds appalls her senses, and her spirit confounds. For now she knows it is no gentle chase, but the blunt boar, rough bear, or lion proud, because the cry remaineth in one place, where fearfully the dogs exclaim aloud. Finding their enemy to be so cursed, they all strain courtesy, who shall cope him first? As falcon to the lure, away she flies. The grass stoops not, she treads on it so light, and in her haste unfortunately spies the foul boar's conquest on her fair delight, which seen, her eyes, as murdered with the view, like stars ashamed of day, themselves withdrew. And being opened, threw unwilling light upon the wide wound that the boar had trenched in his soft flank, whose wonted lily white with purple tears that his wound wept was drenched. No flower was nigh, no grass, herb, leaf, or weed, but stole his blood and seemed with him to bleed. Alas, poor world, what treasure hast thou lost? What face remains alive that's worth the viewing? Whose tongue is music now? What canst thou boast of things long since or anything ensuing? The flowers are sweet, their colors fresh and trim, but true sweet beauty lived and died with him. 'Tis true, 'tis true, thus was Adonis slain. He ran upon the boar with his sharp spear, who did not whet his teeth at him again, but by a kiss thought to persuade him there. And nuzzling in his flank, the loving swine sheathed unaware the tusk in his soft groin. Had I been toothed like him, I must confess, with kissing him I should have killed him first. But he is dead, and never did he bless my youth with his. The more I am accursed. With this she falleth in the place she stood, and stains her face with his congealed blood. She looks upon his lips, and they are pale. She takes him by the hand, and that is cold. She whispers in his ears a heavy tale, as if they heard the woeful words she told. She lifts the coffer lids that close his eyes, where lo, 2 lamps, burnt out, in darkness lies. 2 glasses where herself beheld 1,000 times, and now no more reflect. Their virtue lost, wherein they late excelled, and every beauty robbed of his effect. Wonder of time, quoth she, this is my spite, that thou being dead, the day should yet be light. And that's Venus and Adonis, everybody. Super hot guy gets bored by a bear, goddess not able to sleep with him. It's a tale as old as time, something that happens regularly to me here in Idaho. Thank you so much. That was a slightly shortened version of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. Thank you, Susanna Mars. Oh my gosh, it's so great to see you here. I wish I could take credit for the writing, but I just read it. That's it. What? Oh, Beth Lewis. Oh God, it's gonna get ugly up in here shortly. What questions might I be able to answer for you all about Shakespeare? Yes, Nicole, beautiful and dark. Actually, the interesting thing about Shakespeare's version of Venus and Adonis, it was obviously based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, book 10. It's a beautiful comparison to look at the Shakespeare poem and the version in the Metamorphoses, partly because they were radically different versions. In the Ovid, Adonis is this sort of really butch, super macho, hyper masculine hunter guy who's really not that interested. The only thing he really wants to do is go hunting, and Venus is sort of this fey kind of slightly overtly girlish, weird, weak character. And Shakespeare really takes those 2 characters and changes them pretty dramatically and pretty radically in their gender roles. So one of my favorite lines from the piece is when Venus sees him and she gets so horny, she gets so hot for him because she's a goddess. She has the ability to do this. She just grabs him off his horse and shoves him under her arm and carries him off. And he's all coy and being a little bit sort of, I don't really want to go with you. I just want to go hunting with my friends. So it's a pretty radical gendered reinterpretation of the Venus and Adonis myth. While I was pontificating, there were 8 million questions. Was Shakespeare a famous playwright of his age? Yeah, he was. I mean, Shakespeare was definitely a known playwright during the period. Um, he was not necessarily, by any stretch of the imagination, the most famous or most popular of the Elizabethan period. For example, Thomas Kyd, whom very few people other than dorks like me really know. Most members of the general public haven't even heard of him, but they may have heard of his play, The Spanish Tragedy, which was written in 1589. Spanish Tragedy was by far more popular than any other play that Shakespeare ever wrote. It sold more copies, it was performed more often. Ben Jonson, who is a particular favorite of mine as a playwright from the period, certainly outsold Shakespeare on stage. And he was, in fact, the first playwright of the period to have all of his collected works put together and published as a collection. So both Thomas Kyd and Ben Jonson were probably more famous or better known than Shakespeare. And then the good duo of Beaumont and Fletcher, and also Christopher Marlowe were also hugely popular playwrights of the period. I think it's super important to remember that competition amongst the playwrights in Elizabethan England wasn't necessarily the same as we would think of them now. That kind of competition wasn't sort of as obvious. They collaborated a lot more. They borrowed each other's work. They performed in each other's plays. They wrote each other's stuff. They didn't take credit for a lot of the work that they did for each other. So so there wasn't necessarily that same level of what we would think of as competition for popularity, as we would normally have thought of. What else? Who are Shakespeare's most celebrated contemporaries? Thomas Kyd, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Francis Beaumont, and John Fletcher were all amongst those the sort of big names of the period. We don't know. You know, people often talk about the kind of the Shakespearean canon and what Shakespeare wrote. And what we know about Shakespeare was that not only was he a great writer, but he was also an incredibly gifted thief of other people's stories. Not in a way that we kind of think of now as plagiarism, but the vast majority of Shakespeare's plays were inspired by original source material, whether it was Greek or Roman or other sort of even Italian, French stories. So a lot of those plays of the period by Thomas Kyd, Marlowe, Jonson, Beaumont, Fletcher, they were all doing the same sort of thing, where they were basically borrowing other people's stuff and putting their own twist on it. So they all were kind of in the same boat. What else? How long were the theaters closed during the plague? So the theaters, during the time that Shakespeare wrote Venus and Adonis, this particular period, the theaters were closed from June of 1592 until June of 1594. And during that sort of 2-year period, there were 2 periods of time where the theaters in London were reopened briefly in the winters of 1593 and again in 1594. But it's important to remember that this particular plague period was not the only plague that Shakespeare and his contemporaries lived through. In fact, the year that Shakespeare was born, there was also a plague that hit Stratford upon Avon as well as London. And London theaters had in fact been closed previously and would of course be closed again multiple times. For example, in 1606, the theaters were closed as a result of plague. And it was during that time that Shakespeare who was both an actor and a stakeholder in a theater troupe called the King's Men. He got a lot more written dramatically during that period in 1606 than he did during the period when Venus and Adonis was written. It was during the plague closures in 1606 that Shakespeare was kind of amping up for a big sort of season at court. And so he spent his time in isolation and plague in 1606 writing King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. So he got a lot of dramatic work done during the period of 1606. The other thing he did during the 1592 to 1594 period was he not only wrote Venus and Adonis, but he also wrote The Rape of Lucrece. Those were the two big epic poems, the longer poems that Shakespeare wrote that were hugely successful and were a huge departure for him in terms of being somewhat known as a playwright, but really sort of turning his attention more toward the kind of epic poetry, Virgil, Ovid style of writing epic poetry. It's it is Ashley asks, is it true that Venus Adonis and Adonis is the first work Shakespeare ever published, despite his plays having been produced already? Yes, that is true. Yes. So Shakespeare as a playwright would have been known somewhat. He would have been somewhat familiar to theater-going audiences of that time. But he was just one of many playwrights in a very tough market. There were tons of plays, tons of theaters producing work. And we think he probably wrote 6 or 7 plays before 1592. But it wasn't until that particular period of time when the theaters in London were all closed down and Shakespeare turned his attention towards writing poetry that we got the first book, the first quarto volume that had his name on it as the author. And that went on sale. That was Venus and Adonis. And that went on sale in mid-June 1593. It was the first literary work produced under his name. And really, the question is, why did he do it? Probably out of boredom, couldn't get in, couldn't act, couldn't make money that way, couldn't be a playwright. And so, like many of his colleagues, he sort of jumped on the poetry bandwagon. It was also during a period when the sonnets were kind of taken off. But we know that that he did make money off of the quarto of Venus and Adonis. But it's probably less about him making money off the publication of the poem than it was about him making money off of his patron, the Earl of Southampton. Now, the Earl of Southampton is a really interesting figure in Shakespeare's life, particularly during this time. Not only was he a financial patron, someone who gave plays on the stages, but there is some question about whether or not Shakespeare and the Earl of Southampton may have had a little bit of a thing going on. And there's a whole ginormous history about Shakespeare and the Dark Lady and the sonnets and all of that kind of stuff. But certainly he was commissioned by the Earl of Southampton, or he was interested in getting more patronage from the Earl of Southampton as a result of writing these big sort of weepy, sexy, slightly scandalous epic poems, both Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, as is sort of implied by the name, had some sexy content in them. Venus and Adonis, much more sort of passionate, love story based, sort of very Virgil-like, the sort of classical age poets. And I think my suspicion is that Shakespeare had gotten famous enough during his short time in London as a playwright that he was really trying to expand his reputation as a classical poet and as a great writer. And so following the model of Virgil and the other classical poets to try and get his name out there by writing these kind of lofty lyrical poetry treatises on love and passion was probably one of the things that Shakespeare wanted to do. But of course, we don't know because we don't really know much about Shakespeare as a human being other than what's in his plays. What's the next interesting question? Shakespeare's most famous mention of disease, a plague on both your houses, from Romeo and Juliet. Is this a direct reference to the plague? Yes, it is. Although we're not sure exactly which plague it is a direct reference to. Audiences of the period would have been familiar with at least 3 different major plagues, and that had all ravaged London. In some of the plagues during that time, killed 1 out of 10 people. 30,000 people died in London as a result of some of these plagues. And so Londoners and people all throughout England would have been very familiar with the plague. I think the specific mention of this Mercutio quote, a plague on both of your houses, it's very likely the Black Plague or the bubonic plague that is referencing. But it's actually there's a much more important reference to plague in Romeo and Juliet. I think most people go, oh yeah, plague on both your houses. That's that Romeo and Juliet thing. We've heard that a million times. But what people often don't remember is that the plague is actually the reason why Romeo and Juliet, why the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet actually happens. So people will remember that during Romeo and Juliet, there's a letter. Juliet writes, supposed to give it to Romeo. Friar gives it to another friar. Friar's supposed to take it and deliver it. And he doesn't do that, right? He is unable to deliver the letter telling Romeo the secret plan that Juliet's going to drink the poison and she's not really dead. He should come and find her and all that kind of stuff. The reason that the friar was unable to deliver that letter to Romeo is that he was locked inside his house because they believed that the home Friar John was in was riddled with plague. And so they were stuck inside that house, and the friar was unable to deliver the letter to Romeo, hence the reason why Romeo thinks Juliet is dead at the end of the play. So the plague in Romeo and Juliet has a lot to answer for. That whole thing could have been avoided if people just washed their hands and wore a mask and engaged in social distancing. If only they had known. What else? Are there any Shakespeare plays you would suggest people read during this time? Yes, there are. Not Romeo and Juliet. Everybody's read it. I would suggest that people read Timon of Athens. That is a pretty bad play, to be frank. But it does have some interesting stuff in it about isolation and exclusion and the importance of community. I also I would suggest that if you get about 20 pages into it and you can't do it, just skip it. It's not that great a play. I have been turning my attention over the last couple of weeks to Merchant of Venice. It's a play I've never directed. I am finding it a remarkable insight into notions of justice and kindness and the other, that I think has really interesting things to say about the time that we are living in, around who we blame, who is responsible. I'm struck consistently in the sort of media at the moment around people, sort of laying this current epidemic at the feet of the Chinese, the Wuhan virus. And there are some really beautiful, beautiful responses about justice and empathy and community that are really popping out of the page to me when I'm reading Merchant of Venice. I would also suggest The Tempest, which is a super interesting play. Erica, yes, I love The Tempest. People may not know that The Tempest is one of the plays that that we really don't have a super clear indication of where Shakespeare stole it from. There's some interesting implications about shipwrecks of the time. There may have been a couple of documents, but it's one of the pieces that Shakespeare was almost wholly responsible for creating. So that's always an interesting one. A lightning round of Emily Do. A lightning round of Skull Palmer summarizes Shakespeare. I don't know if I have that much wine. Yeah, I have to have a little bit more right now. Susanna Mars, are there sonnets about isolation? There are certainly sonnets written about loneliness and about being alone, and certainly a lot of the sonnets, The Dark Lady, that whole collection. And if you're interested, you should Google how to read the sonnets in the right order. There's a lot of interesting information out there about how you can read the sonnets in a particular order that give you this really fascinating story about the Shakespeare character and this dark lady that he's clearly pining away for. A lot of the sonnets really do sort of speak directly to a sense of isolation and loneliness, but they're also, a lot of the sonnets are just freaking hilarious and beautiful and about romantic poetry, which is super fun as well. Ashley Coates, I do like the series Slings and Arrows. Yes, in fact, it's on my list of things to do in isolation as we go through the next 2 to 6 weeks or 12 weeks or however long we're supposed to be here. What else? What's really going on with Venus and Adonis? Yeah. What's really going on with Venus and Adonis? So I'm going to just give you my gut, and I have no evidence to support any of this other than just knowing a little bit about the scandalous nature of Shakespeare's relationship with the Earl of Southampton. I am pretty sure that was a booty call poem. There was or at the very least, it was implied that that what was going on in Venus and Adonis, given the sort of like super sexy, kind of visceral, sensual nature of this story, it's pretty obvious that Shakespeare was, and if you'll forgive the air quotes, sucking up to the Earl of Southampton, and really describing this sort of passionate chase between these two people, a very powerful figure, this goddess who was sort of chasing this young man who was maybe not interested in the goddess's attention, but it's, when I read it, it's very clearly meant to be something that is sexually charged, not romantic. Venus not so much in love with the hot Adonis, just really, really wanting a quick roll in the hay with the hottest human male ever born in the history of history. I think comparing the Ovid to the Shakespeare, you get a really clear sense that Shakespeare was adapting the poem for a purpose. My favorite character and my favorite work. My favorite of all Shakespeare plays is Titus Andronicus, which I think is, some people find that a little odd. His first play, a sort of Texas Chainsaw Massacre of Shakespeare, bazillions of people get killed, hundreds of sons, people get their hands chopped off, their tongues cut out, they get chopped up and baked into pies and fed to their mother. It's a horrific, ridiculous, over-the-top piece of tragedy that most people in modern, kind of a contemporary response to it, is that they find it almost sort of Dawn of Evil Dead kind of comedy. It's so grotesque and over the top. But it is also among the most beautiful of all of Shakespeare's verse. He was a young playwright. He hadn't polished his writing to a sort of commercial level at that stage of his career. And he was just very raw and authentic. It's not the most regular of all the verse that he wrote in the canon. But I tell you, I've never read anything more beautiful than the speech that Marcus delivers when he finds Titus's daughter Lavinia in the forest. It is absolutely heartbreaking and some of the most beautiful, perfect language in the canon. I think my favorite text of all the canon is Cleopatra's speech in her conversation after Antony dies, where she talks about the dream of Antony. I dreamed there was an Emperor Antony, oh, such another sleep that I might see, but such another man. It's some of the most beautiful language ever written in English. It's just unbelievably gorgeous. I have directed Titus Andronicus. I directed a full production of Titus at Glasgow Rep many, 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 many years ago, but then also adapted Titus as a something called Kabuki Titus, which we performed at Bag and Baggage a number of years ago, which cut the script down, as I am wont to do, eliminate all the millions of characters, try and go back to some original source material and sort of really focus on the stuff that influenced Shakespeare. And we did that outdoors at the Civic Center with Bag and Baggage, outside with Tyler Neist, who did an original score, performed live with a 9-piece orchestra, and Ann Mueller, who was formerly one of the principal dancers at Oregon Ballet Theater, performed the role of Lavinia. It was amazing. Thank you, Misty. Yeah, I think it was pretty good. I liked it a lot. Some more background about me. What guided you to your passion in the arts? So when I was in junior high school in Hillsboro, Oregon, at Brown Junior High, we went to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival as a group. There were about 40 of us. My mom, who is one of 4 daughters, 4 sisters. My grandfather was ill with Alzheimer's disease at the time and was in a care home in Forest Grove. And my mom and her sisters were embattled trying to figure out what to do with my grandfather and his illness. And when we went to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, we all went to see King Lear, which I had never read, hadn't ever heard anything about. And Stephanie Shine, who is the artistic director at Seattle Shakes, was Cordelia in that production. And I was immediately fascinated by the fact that this story that was being performed on the Oregon Shakespeare Festival stage felt so much like, except for the blindings and all that kind of stuff, not so much in the Palmer House, but the story of these 3 women trying to figure out how to deal with a father struck down by madness, a great man who had sort of fallen from the heights of passion and strength, was absolutely relevant and completely connected to me in a really profound way. It was a very long production. It was 3.5, almost 4 hours with 2 intermissions. And at the first intermission, my colleagues and I, all the students and I, walked out into the lobby, and they were all just bitching about how much they hated it. They didn't understand what's going on. They wanted to go home. And my teacher was like, "Oh my God, stop yelling at me. Fine, fine, fine. We can leave. But if even one of you wants to stay, we will all stay." And I said I wanted to find out what happened. So I made all of they were friends at the time. After that, they weren't so friendly with me anymore. We all stayed and we watched the rest of it. And when I got back to Hillsboro, I started shoplifting Shakespeare from the Hillsboro Public Library, because I didn't want anyone to know that I liked it and that I was a dork. So I literally stole copies of Hamlet, Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream, King Lear, and others from the Hillsboro Public Library. I have made amends. I have made donations back to the Hillsboro Public Library to apologize for my criminality. But I was hooked. The language, the density of the stories, the characters, and how much they spoke to my life. That was really what kind of got me hooked on Shakespeare and on theater. Um, what's my favorite version of Midsummer? That's a really great question, Ashley. Um, this is going to be ridiculous, but I don't really like to watch film adaptations of Shakespeare. But Christopher Stoll, former artistic director at Oregon Ballet Theater, did, without question, my favorite ballet version of Midsummer Night's Dream I've ever seen. It was beautiful, absolutely amazing. Really captured the joy and the wonder and the childish dorkiness of Midsummer Night's Dream, which I absolutely loved. Um, yes, Amelia, Tyler's score for Titus was really, really unbelievable. What else? 6:42. I've been at this for 45 minutes. I only had 2 sips of wine. Let me say, I'm Scott Bauer. You, you Ashley should have been yelling at me about this. I'm currently producing artistic director of Company of Fools in Sun Valley, Idaho, formerly the founding artistic director of Bag and Baggage Productions in Hillsboro, Oregon. And before that was the founding artistic director of Glasgow Repertory Company in Glasgow, Scotland. I have some small experience of screwing around with Shakespeare's stories, and rewriting them, because why not? Why not? I would also just say, how do we donate? Thank you, Misty. I'm going to ask you to think about 2 things for me. If you are interested in donating, please consider giving to Company of Fools, which is the theater company that I head at the moment. You can do that online at svmoa.org. Company of Fools is a proud part of the Sun Valley Museum of Art. We are the largest cultural institution in the state of Idaho. And we, like everyone else in the country, are going through hard times. We are not only a theater company, Company of Fools, but we also have an education and enrichment program that serves hundreds and thousands of students all across the Wood River Valley here in central Idaho. We also have a museum and a gallery space, as well as a performing arts branch. So we would love to have your contribution to svmoa.org. Thank you so much for your generosity. But I would also, if you are more interested in supporting theater companies and organizations in the Portland area, I'm going to ask you to consider giving to Bag and Baggage Productions, my former home, my artistic heart, and an organization that is also struggling with the impacts of the coronavirus throughout the country and also in Portland. I know things are really hard for everybody there. And if Bag and Baggage doesn't fit the bill, please just give to an arts organization. Give money to whatever arts organization you love. The closest one to you geographically, the closest one to you ethically, morally, artistically. We are all scared about what's coming. So your generous support in any way that you can would be gratefully received by every nonprofit arts organization on the planet. Yeah, just give money. We're worried, and you can help make it work by buying tickets, buying gift certificates, making contributions, buying season passes, doing whatever you got to do to make it work. So thank you so much. I would also just remind you that Happy Hour, Artslandia's Happy Hour goes, is it every single night? Every single night at 5:00. That's crazy. That seems like a lot. I'm really glad I don't have to do this every single night. Happy Hour starts at 5 p.m. on Artslandia's Facebook page. I know that tomorrow night, Jamie Hampton, pal of mine and a friend, co-artistic director at Bodyvox, will be sharing his musical talents with a set list that includes favorites from Bruce Springsteen to Oasis, as well as original songs. You should all, if you watch tomorrow night, you should make him dance while he sings. That would be great. And give money to them as well, and give money to any of the people who did stuff last night. Give money, give money, give money, give money. That would be super helpful. So Artslandia Happy Hour every weekday at 5 p.m. What else do you want me to do? Jackie, have ever considered writing a book on Shakespeare? No, I'm in the rehearsal room way too often, way too much. This has been really fun. I haven't had anywhere near enough to drink, and I'm grumpy at all of you for keeping me away from my wine. Best of luck to you all. Keep the faith. Stay focused. Check in with your friends. Check in with your artistic leaders. Check in with your actors. We need you now more than ever. Please consider giving generously to everybody and anyone at all. Am I done now? Drink. Thank you, Nicole. I will. I'm going to click the end live video button now.